Fixing leaky pipes with forage herbs. Quite a strange principle, but it does represent exactly what I want to carry across with this presentation, and that is having you rethink how you view your pasture systems, but also yourself as a manager or producer. So for the purposes of this presentation, I want you to think of yourself as the distiller of a fine craft brew. But instead of grains, water and some other secret ingredients, your inputs are going to be things like the species you decide to plant, how you manage your irrigation, the fertilizers you apply, and even how you feed concentrates on farm. That's all going to combine into your signature recipe or pasture system. Instead of feeding into a large copper still, your fermenter is going to be your dairy cow, and she is going to use all of those ingredients to produce your craft brew or milk. The thing is just that over time, we might have started to develop leaky pipes within our systems that are reducing our efficiency. So in our grass monoculture systems, typically in the region reliant on kikuyu and ryegrass, I've identified 3 leaky pipes we need to look at. And the first one is the need to annually oversow our entire pasture platform. Now, the need for this is driven by the fact that our ryegrass component doesn't persist very well. And this is because our summers tend to be relatively hot and dry in the region. The ryegrass plants then really struggle to survive, and we lose that component and we need to replace it. The second leaky pipe is the slump in summer production we often see in our region. Now that is driven by those ryegrass plants really struggling through the summer. You might have tufts where there's a lot of leaf death, and that negatively impacts quality, but also because a large component of our pastures may be kikuyu. And we all know that kikuyu has a relatively low forage quality compared to some temperate pasture species, and that all suppresses milk production. The third and last leaky pipe I want to address is fodder flow. So this is two-pronged. The first one is that we need to ensure that we're producing as much as possible fodder on farm so we don't have to buy in feed, because buying in feed is one of the major leaks within our system. The second one is the junk in, junk out principle. So if you're cutting your silage from your ryegrass component in the spring, when it is overgrown, lodged, and in the reproductive phase, it stands to reason that you're probably not producing very high quality silage. Also, if you're cutting silage off of kikuyu, you need to understand that it's likely to have a relatively low forage quality. This means that although we assume our animals are grazing really high quality pastures in the winter, half of their intake might actually be coming from very low quality silage, which could actually negatively impact our winter production. Now, the thing about leaky pipes is, of course, you can try and plug them through making small management tweaks, but a better approach would probably be to simply replace those leaky pipes with better new pipes. And this is really where the new heroes in the pasture game can change how our pasture systems function quite radically. And I'm in particular referring to species like chicory, plantain, and the newer varieties of tall fescue. So these species have the advantage that they do actively grow during the summer months, they have a very high forage quality, and they also have the advantage that due to their deeper root systems and other characteristics, they may be more resilient to our hot, dry summers. Another advantage is that they actually combine really well with legumes like lucerne and red clover, which up until now we've struggled to incorporate into our kikuyu ryegrass systems. So what did we do on Outeniqua? Well, we decided we needed to evaluate these species on a much larger scale. And we did that in the form of a farmlet study. So we had 4 farmlets of 5 hectares each, and they were allocated a unique pasture system each. So the first farmlet was a traditional kikuyu ryegrass system, where we simply oversowed the kikuyu on an annual basis. Then for the remaining 3 farmlets, we sprayed out the existing kikuyu. And on the one farmlet, we established a mixture containing plantain, red clover, and tall fescue. Another farmlet, referred to as the monoculture system, we established half of the farmlet to plantain monoculture and the other half to a tall fescue monoculture. And the animals would then typically graze the plantain in the morning and the tall fescue in the evenings. The fourth and last system was only included from year 2 onwards, and here we established a mixture containing plantain, chicory, ryegrass, and lucerne. Now, aside from the novel species and mixtures we evaluated, we also aimed to manage these systems more closely to represent what happens on farm. So what we would do is each system was measured individually, and those measurements were used to allocate pasture to the respective mini herds within each farmlet. So each farmlet had its own mini herd of 25 cows, which means that we maintained a permanent stocking rate throughout the year of approximately 4 cows per hectare, and the days in milk we maintained at 150. We also did a weekly walk on each system, and that was used for fodder flow planning. So we viewed each system as a closed system. So if, for example, within a system we saw that pasture supply exceeded demand, we would then cut silage on that particular system. The silage from that system would then be fed back into the system when pasture demand exceeded supply. And much like what would happen on farm, if we eventually ran out of silage, we had to buy in lucerne, and that was fed into the system. This had the advantage that we could very accurately and precisely determine how much we were leaking from that pipe in terms of fodder flow. So let's address the first pipe, and that is the need to oversow our entire farm on an annual basis. So what I'm showing you here is the contribution of the sown component to the sward. And the first system we're going to look at is the Kikuyu ryegrass system. So here our sown component, for example, would be ryegrass. And what was very interesting is that even at its best, the ryegrass only contributed 80% to the sward components. And year on year, during November, we saw that extremely rapid decline in the ryegrass component's contribution. And this really does highlight the need to replace that component on an annual basis. But how did the alternative grass species, in other words, fescue, fare? What was really good to see is that particularly during the summer months, it did seem to persist very well during year 1, year 2, and even year 3, although during year 3 it was to a lesser degree, and we did start seeing a decline in the fescue component. And this was all achieved through a sward that was not oversown at any point. So how did the systems where we included a forage herb fare in terms of persistence over years? Well, here in red we have the plantain monoculture, in blue we have that fescue plantain red clover mixture, and in black we have the lucerne herb mixture. And what we found is that basically throughout the whole period, we could almost maintain that sown component at above 80%. What was obviously a bit concerning is the rapid decline we saw in all our sown components during year 3 in the summer. And the big question is, why did that happen? So my theory is that it is largely driven by climate. So at the bottom, I'm going to show you the rainfall received during the respective months as a percentage of the long-term rainfall. So the red blocks represent months when we received rainfall below 50% of the long-term average. The yellow ones when it was at about 70 to 80%. The green ones when it was on par, so between 80 and 100% of the long-term average. And the one blue block is when we received rainfall way above the long-term average. And what you'll notice is that that decline occurs directly after we receive that really good rainfall in the spring and then another good season in the summer. So why did this then happen? Well, what happens when we spray off the Kikuyu and we establish the new pastures, we'll initially have a really dense competitive sward. However, the loss of plants over time is inevitable to a degree due to things like trampling, grazing, and maybe even diseases. That then results in gaps within the sward. Now, during a relatively dry or normal season, it's likely that species like the fescue, the chicory, and even the lucerne and plantain can be highly competitive, so we don't have a big issue. But when we have that very wet spring, followed by a summer when the temperatures are high and we also had really good rainfall, we will see species like Kikuyu, broadleaf weeds, and very competitive perennial grasses like typal or Erogrostis and Spirobolus and even Paspalum starting to fill in those gaps. So what species were actually filling those gaps as we lost our sown component? So here we're going to look at the composition of the different pasture types in the summer of 2021-2022 following that wet spring in terms of the sown component, the kikuyu component, and then other grasses, typically things like typal in dark grey and the broadleaf weeds in light grey. So we're first going to look at the kikuyu ryegrass system. And what was really interesting here is that we see that those other grasses actually contributed the same percentage almost as the kikuyu in the system. Now, this is really problematic because obviously in a grass monoculture system, we will really struggle to spray these other grasses out, especially if our main component in terms of that is something like typal, which is a very hardy perennial and difficult to get rid of. So let's look at the plantain monoculture, and what you'll see here is that yes, there's still a major contribution made by the plantain, a smaller contribution by the kikuyu, and this is because we did actually try and spray out the grasses, and it appears that the kikuyu was sensitive to that herbicide treatment. But what is a challenge here is that once again, those hardy perennial other grasses were difficult to spray out, and we also have a much larger broadleaf weed component, which is obviously impossible to spray out in the plantain. So in the fescue monoculture, we see once again that the grassy weeds are our biggest challenge, a small contribution made by the kikuyu and then also those other hardy perennials. For the fescue plantain clover mix, what was really interesting is that you'll see that kikuyu had started invading the system quite hectically during this summer, and it's likely that one would then have to try and get rid of that. For the lucerne herb mix, keeping in mind that this was only its second year of production, we see that there is still a relatively good sown component apparent in that kind of sward, with an equal contribution almost made by the different weedy species, namely kikuyu, other grasses, and broadleaf weeds. So, how would those mixtures then also change over time? And this is really important because you want to know when you're losing what components. So here we have this botanical composition of the fescue plantain red clover mix. The plantain is in blue, the red clover in red, the fescue in yellow, and the weeds in black. So for this system, what we found was that plantain was the major contributor to the sward throughout year 1 and year 2. But we did start to see that component decline in its contribution heading into year 3. Now, what did happen is that the fescue almost could kind of increase the contribution it made, replacing the plantain, but it was not good enough to prevent those weeds from coming into the system. What was also slightly concerning in this system is you'll see that the red clover made a really good contribution during the first spring and summer, and then it rapidly declined. Now, the thing here is that we always used to think it's a species impact, but what we've discovered since then is that it might actually be a variety effect. So maybe if we could get a red clover variety that's more persistent, we wouldn't be struggling with this rapid decline. Another option would be, if we are stuck with these varieties, then to replace that red clover component heading into year 2. So next, we're going to look at the lucerne herb mix. And what we found here is that during the first winter in particular, the major contributor to the sward was the ryegrass. But then we did see that typical rapid decline from November onwards for our region. What was really great was that the chicory then kind of increased in terms of its contribution during the first summer following establishment, but it also showed a decline in its contribution heading into the winter. And then we kind of see that the components stabilize, with all of them making a notable contribution. Whilst during the second summer, we see that lucerne is now our major contributor. And both of these systems really highlight how rapidly composition can change from one month to the next within these systems. but also how challenging the management of that composition can be for us as managers. So how did these new species then fare at addressing the leaky pipe of having to oversow on an annual basis? Well, they definitely have the potential to persist a lot better than the ryegrass component, but you have to be cognizant of the fact that you might have to replace lost components strategically to reduce the rate at which weeds invade your pastures. The big challenge for us here is obviously determining when these actions need to be taken, what we need to do, and how extreme those actions need to be, but also determining how external factors may affect these changes. So being able to adapt quite rapidly as conditions change. So now we're going to move to the second leaky pipe. Now, if you remember correctly, that leaky pipe was that drop in summer production in terms of milk yield. So there's much debate amongst pasture-based dairy producers and the industry on what drives milk production per hectare. Is it pushing up your grazing capacity as high as possible or maintaining milk yield per cow? So traditionally in our grass systems, I think a lot of the milk yield per hectare was probably driven by maintaining high grazing capacity, so pushing animal numbers. But could these new systems mean that we should also be looking at maintaining higher milk yield per cow? And hopefully we're going to be able to answer that question. So with this in mind, what I'm going to show you now is the grazing capacity in the top graph in cows per hectare on a monthly basis during year 1, and also the milk yield per cow per day at the bottom. The blue line is that fescue plantain red clover mix, the red line is our monoculture system, and the yellow line is our kikuyu ryegrass system. So the first thing I want to draw your attention to is that in terms of milk yield per cow and also grazing capacity, these systems compared very favorably to each other, so the worry that including forage herbs is going to suppress your grazing capacity during winter is largely unfounded. What we then found is that during that spring, the grazing capacity of the fescue plantain clover mix was really the highest, and then as we head into summer and autumn, as expected, when our kikuyu is really pumping, the grazing capacity for the kikuyu ryegrass system was the highest. So what happened in terms of milk yield, and this is where it gets really good, you'll see that that fescue plantain red clover managed to maintain a higher milk yield than the grass systems from spring through to autumn. And at times it had a higher milk yield of up to 2 liters per cow per day, particularly during those summer-autumn months. So did we see a similar pattern in year 2? Well, when we look at year 2, the first thing I want to draw your attention to is the higher milk yield we obtained from that fescue plantain red clover mixture compared to the other systems. Now, my theory here is that the silage we cut in the previous spring off of the system was of a really good quality because we had a high clover content, we had the plantain, and we had the fescue. And as we fed that high quality silage into that system during the winter months, it actually pushed up the milk yield from that system. So what happened in the other seasons? Well, as expected, the kikuyu ryegrass system had a really good or high grazing capacity. I wouldn't say good, but a high grazing capacity during the summer and autumn months. But once again, our systems based on forage herbs, so the fescue plantain red clover mix and also that lucerne herb mix maintained a higher milk yield than the other systems from summer through to autumn. Now, year 3 is where we can really learn some important lessons. So if you remember correctly, what happened in a lot of these systems is that the weeds now started invading the pastures. So for example, this fescue plantain red clover mix had a large kikuyu component during the summer and autumn, and you'll see that its grazing capacity now more closely represents that of the kikuyu ryegrass. What was really concerning is that when we look at the milk yield per cow, we found that they're all kind of pulling closer to each other. So the conclusion is that as weedy grasses increase in our pastures, grazing capacity will increase as expected, but milk yield per cow also decreases, highlighting the need to maintain that forage herb component if we want to maintain milk yield per cow within these systems. So how did these trends then translate into milk yield per hectare? Because that's really what we're striving to, is to maximize milk yield per hectare. Here we have the energy corrected milk yield per hectare for the systems during year 1, year 2, and year 3. And what was interesting is that during all 3 years, the highest milk yield per hectare was actually obtained from that fescue plantain red clover mixture. Just as a side note, you'll see that the Lucerne herb mix has a relatively low milk yield per hectare during year 2, and that was largely attributed to the fact that we did plant it slightly later, so the animals grazed this system for 2 months less than the other systems during this year. When we then try and figure out whether pasture yield drives the milk yield per hectare, these black dots are then the total pasture yield per annum for the different systems. And what we see is that only during year 1 did high pasture yields actually result in the highest milk yield per hectare, keeping in mind that this was actually a relatively dry year. From year 2 onwards, so during year 2 and year 3, we see that even though the fescue plantain red clover mix had the lowest pasture yield per hectare, it still maintained the highest milk yield per hectare, whereas the kukui ryegrass system that had the highest pasture yield per hectare actually didn't manage to produce the highest milk yield per hectare. So in addressing our second leaky pipe, which is that slump in milk yield during summer and autumn, it seems that in forage herb-based systems, forage quality, driven by the forage herb component, stimulates milk production from spring to autumn, highlighting the need for us to maintain that forage herb content over years. So now we're moving on to our third and last leaky pipe, which is that fodder flow pipe. So on this graph, I have the total pasture yield for the different systems. So the seasonal yield is blue, indicates the winter yield, green, the spring yield, orange, the summer yield, and the yellow, the autumn yield. And the highest yield within each season is then indicated by that black border. And at the top, we have the total annual yield, and the highest yield within a year is indicated in a black block. So during year 1, the highest pasture yield was for that fescue plantain red clover mix. During year 2, it was for the kukui ryegrass system, and also during year 3 for the kukui ryegrass system. Now, what was a bit concerning is obviously this great decline in the pasture yield for our fescue plantain clover mix, and that was probably due to the loss of that red clover component. And what happened within the system is that we had a relatively low spring yield during year 2, which means we couldn't cut a lot of silage, and that, accompanied by the relatively low winter yield in year 3, means that these animals would have to be fed a large amount of lucerne hay in the winter, which is really challenging in terms of our fodder flow. So the big thing to realize here is that maybe that decline could have been avoided if we replaced that red clover component. But it does allow us to kind of reevaluate how we view our fodder flow. So the reason I'm showing you this graph is that I kind of want to hit home how bigger impact the buying in of fodder can have on your bottom line. So on this graph, what I did was the green bar represents the intake of our mini herd from the pasture grown on farm. The blue one indicates intake on an annual basis from our homegrown silage, and the red indicates bought in feed, so in this case lucerne hay. And it really becomes concerning when we have to buy in 10% of our cows' intake on an annual basis from lucerne, and it even goes up to 14% in year 3. So how does this impact our bottom line? Well, just to give you an idea, if you had a dairy herd of approximately 500 animals and you fed them 10% of the total intake on an annual basis from lucerne, it means that you would have to buy in a total of 91 tons of lucerne. So what's the message here? Well, you can do one of two things. You either need to make certain you match your stocking rate to your system. So maybe in these systems, because we're getting higher milk yield per cow, we can slightly lower our stocking rate. But I think more importantly, we need to ensure that interventions occur timeously. So potentially if we had replaced that red clover component going into year 2 and year 3, we wouldn't have run into those fodder flow issues on that system. And so we come to the end of this presentation. Now, I'm not going to have a conclusion slide that reiterates all of these points we've been trying to make. I think the message is quite clear. And at the root of it is that we need to innovate and adapt. It's not a constant thing, and you need to understand your own system to make your best choices. But if you decide that forage herbs and fescues aren't the way to go, you can always do what this farmer in England did and become an actual distiller, where he distills vodka from his milk. And with that, I want to thank you, and please feel free to contact me on my email if you have any questions or maybe a few remarks on this presentation. Cheers, everyone.
There are for. So the question is, can forage herbs and alternative perennial grasses be used to improve summer and autumn production quality at that time of the year? Treatments. The trial was established on the 5th of October 2016 at the Outeniqua Research Farm. We had 2 forage herbs, narrowleaf plantain and chicory, 3 grasses, perennial ryegrass, tall fescue and cocksfoot, and mixtures of all of those. So perennial ryegrass with plantain and perennial ryegrass, and with tall fescue with either plantain and or chicory, and cocksfoot similarly with plantain and with chicory, and then plantain and chicory also mixed in a treatment. The methods we used, we analyzed the forage quality using near infrared. The parameters we used in these data are crude protein, NDF, NFC, and TDN. We calculated ME and DMI, and from the trial we determined dry matter yield and botanical composition, which was determined on a dry matter basis. The guidelines that we generally look for in terms of crude protein, that dairy cows require a minimum of 16% crude protein in their diet. So crude protein at 18 to 20% would be considered good, and above 24% arguably too high. The neutral detergent fiber or NDF percentage, if it's less than 30%, it would be too low. 30 to 40 would be considered good quality grazing, while 40 to 50 would still be reasonable, and greater than 60 would be considered poor. Starting off with the crude protein for the summer of 2017, which was the first summer. At the bottom we have the various treatment combinations, starting off with plantain on the far left, the light blue, followed by chicory in the dark blue. Then the crosshatched bars are the mixtures. Firstly, plantain with the 3 grasses, then chicory with the 3 grasses, and then chicory and plantain. And the orange bars are the 3 grasses, perennial ryegrass, tall fescue, and cocksfoot. If we look at the results, we see that plantain was around 14% crude protein on the low side. And we see that in the mixtures, it was equally low, but that is because the mixtures were dominated at more than 90%. So there was almost no grass present in the mixtures during the first summer. If we look at the chicory, similarly, the mixtures were very similar to the pure stand because the mixtures were dominated by the chicory. If we now skip to the 4th summer, which was summer 2020, the important thing here is that the composition of the pasture had changed substantially. The tall fescue and the cocksfoot had increased. In the plantain, the tall fescue now had a 57% component, in the chicory a 46% component, while the coxsfoot in the plantain had a 59% component, and the coxsfoot in the chicory a 71%. The perennial ryegrass composition had decreased to below 25%. So what we see here is the plantain coxsfoot and chicory coxsfoot treatments have relatively low values, as does the coxsfoot pure stand, which is similar to the mixed as the coxsfoot. All the others treatments are between 16 and 18%, while the chicory tall fescue is above 20%. Coming to the NDF percentage, firstly for the first summer of 2017, and remembering that our target for good quality pasture is 30 to 40%. The forage herb pure stands and the forage herb mixtures were all between 30 and 40%, so within the target range. But remembering that at this stage of the trial, the mixtures, which are the crosshatched bars, were all dominated by forage herbs at more than 90%. The grasses had an NDF of greater than 50%, which is poorer quality than we would prefer for dairy pastures. And the perennial ryegrass was at the highest of the three grasses at this stage in late summer, at above 50%. If we now look at the NDF percentage for the third summer, which was 2019, in the mixtures, the composition has now started to change with an increased grass component, and the grass component is between 28 and 38% in the plantain, with coxsfoot at 38%, being the third crosshatched bar, and that NDF was then greater than 40. In the chicory mixtures, the grass component is 39% for the perennial ryegrass, and the tall fescue and coxsfoot grass component was up to 71%, and their NDFs were then greater than 40. The perennial ryegrass was lower than previously, but only 40% of that pasture was actually perennial ryegrass, and the rest were weeds. So the tall fescue and the coxsfoot of the pure grasses were still above 50%. If we now look at metabolizable energy for the first summer, the ME for the grasses was lowest, especially the perennial ryegrass at only 10.1. The mixtures at this stage were dominated by the forage herbs, and the MEs ranged from 10.6 to 11.2, as you can see in the crosshatched bars. In looking at the ME for the fourth summer, which was 2020, you can see that the plantain and chicory, the first two bars, the ME was around 10.6. The mixtures were now dominated by the grasses, by the tall fescue and coxsfoot, and the perennial ryegrass composition was less than 25%, and we see lower MEs there. We see also a poor ME in the pure stand perennial ryegrass at about 9.8. The tall fescue coxsfoot mixtures had the highest ME and similar to the pure herbs. Now, forage quality always needs to go together with good yield. So one needs to make sure that the pasture also has a good biomass production. So in this graph are three summer yields represented. The blue is the first summer, the red is the third summer, and the green is the fourth summer. And the pure plantain and pure chicory, as well as the mixtures, out-yielded the grasses being on the far right of the graph, with the perennial ryegrass actually having the lowest summer yield over the 3 summers represented in this graph. So from a yield point of view, the herbs and the herb grass mixes we now look at dry matter intake calculated for a 450 kg cow for the first summer of 2017. On the far right, the orange bars, the grasses were below 11 kg dry matter intake per day, while the forage herbs, pure stands, and the mixtures, which were dominated by the forage herbs, are above 14, and some even above 16 kgs dry matter intake for a 450 kg cow. The DMI is calculated for summer 2020 were as follows. On the far right, the 3 grasses remained low at approximately 10 kgs intake per day, while the plantain and chicory pure stands, as well as the mixture of chicory and plantain, which is the last of the cross-hatched bars, have the highest intake at around 14 kgs. Where the cocksfoot dominates the pasture, the DMI is low, and in the perennial ryegrass forage herb treatments, the forage herbs are dominant, which gives it a higher value. And where tall fescue dominates, the value is reasonable, especially compared to the cocksfoot. So in conclusion, grass pasture on its own, especially perennial ryegrass, is the poorest option for summer. Tall fescue is a good alternative in terms of yield, persistence, and has reasonable forage quality, but it should best be used in a mixture. Cocksfoot has good yield and persistence. Forage quality is marginal. The plantain and the chicory provide improved quality in the summer for the summer pasture in comparison to the perennial ryegrass, but one would need to add a legume to improve the crude protein content, for example, a red clover. The grass forage herbs mixtures thus provide improved quality if forage herbs are the dominant component. So preferably greater than 60%. Not 100% sure about that, or possibly at least between 50 and 60% is what this data suggests, but this will require further research to confirm that. I would just like to acknowledge the plant science team, who together with the technicians are very instrumental in collecting this data, doing the field work, harvesting the trials, and so forth. So farm for their support with the irrigation and the land prep and such. Thank you. This presentation will give a summary of the evaluation results of perennial ryegrass and tall fescue cultivars for the 2-year period 2020 and 2021. Parameters for which data is provided in this presentation is yield, growth rates, leaf rust, reproductive tillers or bolting, sward density, and leaf emergence rate. More detailed results and information is provided in the booklet. Starting with perennial ryegrass, the flow consisted of 11 diploid cultivars and 5 tetraploid cultivars. The harvest criteria were the 3-leaf stage, or in spring, canopy closure if it was before the 3-leaf stage. Starting with the results, the total yield for the 2-year period is represented in this graph. At the bottom are the cultivars, and on the left-hand side, the yield in tons dry matter per hectare. The darker the bar, the higher the yield, and the highest yielding cultivar was Viscount, and similar to Viscount were Governor, Platform, Legion, and 50/50. Looking at the yield for year 1 versus year 2, so comparing the 2 years with each other. Again, yield in tons dry matter is on the y-axis. The green bars represent the first year, with the highest yielding on the left-hand side. Basically, Viscount was the highest yielding, and similar to Viscount were Platform, Governor, 50/50, Base, Legion, Nui, Tanker, and 150 in year 1. Year 2 is then represented by the blue bars, and the dark blue bars represent the significantly highest yielding cultivars. So of the ones that yielded best in year 1, only Viscount, Platform, Governor, 50/50, Base, and Legion also yielded the best in year 2, with Viscount significantly the highest, while Nui, Tanker, and 150 were significantly lower yielding in year 2, as indicated by the circle. Kimbuku and Tugela were amongst the highest yielding in year 2. However, they were not the highest yielding group in year 1. Looking more specifically at winter yield, the highest yielding in year 1, which are the green bars, so winter year 1, was Platform and Legion, followed by 150, Base, and Nui. Year 2 is in the blue bars, and we can see the winter yield of year 2 is extremely low compared to year 1. There are some cultivars that yielded better, so the darker the color, the better the yield. However, none of them performed really well in the second winter. Looking at the 2 summer time periods, the summer 2020-2021 versus summer 21-22. The first summer is in the green bars, and the graph is organized in the order of the green bars from highest to lowest, from top to bottom, and the blue is the second summer. So the first thing we see is that Nui had no second summer yield. The 3 cultivars that yielded best in the first and second summer were Viscount, Governor, and Base, which we can see at the top of the graph. Then there were some cultivars that had a better yield in summer 2 than summer 1, but they were not highest yielding in summer 1. That is a negative attribute in terms of not being in the top yielding group in summer 1, but they were persistent and high yielding into summer 2. Looking at the flowering behavior of the perennial ryegrass cultivars, at the top of the table we have the various harvests from 1 to 9, which is basically from May through to February, which was the first year. The percentage bolting is dependent on how cold the winter is. Basically, how many cold days the winter brings and how this coincides with the requirements of each cultivar. Some cultivars will require more cold days for flowering than others. What we can see in the table is firstly the flowering window, which for some, like 24/7, Evans and 150 already starts in September, and for quite a few it extends right through to mid-January, which was harvest 8 or cut 8. Then we can see where the peaks are. Basically, the peaks are October and November, with some still having a fair amount of flowering going into December. Some varieties flowered more than others, with Evans, Tanker and Viscount having fairly high percentages at certain times, at their peak basically. And then some varieties did not flower at all. Those were Kabuku and Poti, meaning that their cold requirement was not met in that particular winter. Looking at plant counts, we counted the plants using the 10-point method and then converting that to a percentage. In August 2020, which was basically after successful establishment, so what would be considered a full sward at that stage. Then again, April 2021, so after the summer, and March 2022, which would be after the second summer. So the blue bars represent the initial plant count. Here one should compare each variety on its own because each plant count would be specific to that variety. So we can see the red bars are after the first summer and the green bars after the second summer. If we look at, for instance, the variety on the far right of the graph, Viscount, it had a higher percentage plants in the second, after the first summer, the red bar, and in this after the third summer, it did have a slight drop in plants, but compared to what it started off with, the drop was much less than some other varieties. And the same for Platform. Platform also had a slightly higher count after the summer, and then a slight drop after the second summer. And if we look at Tugela, which is the second from the right, that also had a better count after the summer, however, not so good after the second summer. So the first summer slightly better, second summer not so good. The same with Base on the third one from the left, a higher, slightly higher count after the first summer, but then a much reduced count in the green bars after the second summer. Some of the other varieties had a declining plant count from establishment through to as the trial progressed. This graph represents the leaf emergence rate for perennial ryegrass, which represents the number of days it takes to grow a leaf, and remembering that we would want to defoliate or graze the pasture at 3-leaf stage. So this is the average number of days required for 1 leaf. The main drivers for leaf emergence rate are temperature and soil moisture. So if soil moisture is adequate, then the main effect is temperature. We can see in the graph that in both winter periods, it took 16 days to grow a leaf, so the leaf emergence rate was 16 days. In spring, it came down to 12 days, and in summer down to 10 days. After the second summer, the rate was slightly variable, which may have been related to the moisture and temperature conditions at the time. Now looking at tall fescue and the fescue type Festiloliums. This trial consisted of 12 continental type tall fescue cultivars, which are basically summer active, 1 Mediterranean tall fescue, and 3 tall fescue type Festiloliums that made up this trial. This graph represents the total yield for a 2-year period, split into the 2 years. So year 1 is represented by the blue bars and year 2 by the green bars. So in year 1, the highest yielding cultivar was Royal Q, followed by Tower, and equal to them was Quantico, Temora, and Duramax. The graph is organized in order of highest yielding in year 1. Year 2, the green bars, the highest yielding cultivar was the Mediterranean type Temora, and similar to it were the yields for Royal Q, Tower, and Quantico. And the total yields over that 2-year period, the highest was Royal Q with 30.6, followed by Quantico with 30.3, Temora, which is the Mediterranean type, with 29.8, and Tower with 29.5. So those were all similar in terms of the no significant difference between those first 5 cultivars. If we look more specifically at the first winter versus the second winter, first winter is represented in blue and the second winter in the green or light color. You clearly see that Temora, which is the Mediterranean type, which is a winter active type, was significantly highest yielding in both the first and the second winter, and in fact it yielded even more in the second winter than it did in the first. Then the graph is organized according to winter yield of the first winter, the light blue bars, and then the light color bars are represented in the second winter. So the varieties Royal Q, Quantico, and Boschhoek had a relatively good yield in the second winter, but still the overall yield for winter is not very high, as it is between 2 and 2.5 tons, and in the second winter around 2 tons per hectare. So this one just needs to take cognizance of that the winter production of tall fescue is somewhat constrained. Looking at the summer yield, which is of course very good for tall fescue. The blue is the first summer and the green the second summer. See the dark blue bars on the left-hand side of the graph were the highest yielding, and that those were Quantico, Paolo, and Tower, were all the same. And the green bars, the dark green, are all the same. That is the second summer. And also in the second summer, Paolo, Quantico, and Tower had a good yield. There were some others that had a good yield, those darkish green bars. In the second summer, however, they were not amongst the highest yielding group in the first summer. Looking at the flowering behavior of the tall fescues, the first thing to notice is that the flowering window is shorter than for ryegrass. So for tall fescue, it is September to November. Some are October to November, while in the ryegrasses it tends to be September to January or October to December. And again, the percentage bolting for each cultivar would be dependent on how many cold days the winter has had and if that meets the requirements of the particular variety. So you can see quite a lot of differences between the different cultivars in terms of flowering, with some having hardly any flowering, but generally the flowering percentage being relatively low, with some peaking at a particular harvest. Some with the Mediterranean type Timora being the earliest flowering, most of the flowering in September, and most of the cultivars flowering slightly later, but with a shorter window than the ryegrasses. This graph looks at flowering and NDF, which we know is linked. So obviously, if the plants are flowering, the NDF will be higher. And this is particularly for October 2021. For that month, when flowering is generally peaking for the tall fescue that particular year. And we can see that as at the bottom we have the flowering or reproductive tillers, and on the left hand side we have the NDF percentage, and as the flowering or reproductive tiller count goes up, so does the NDF. So what is most useful? It's the ones that are in the far left of the graph that have a low flowering percentage and thus also a low NDF, or as low as it can be during that time of the year. This just represents the NDF percentage for two different harvests. The blue is May 2021 and the orange is October 2021. And you can clearly see the ones in the orange that are flowering have the slightly higher values, whereas there is not that much difference in May in the blue when there is no flowering. Just to put it into perspective, if we compare it to perennial ryegrass, if we look at the little table at the bottom, so for the tall fescue, it is between, in May, it is between 50 and 55, and in October, the ones that are flowering can go up to 60. The perennial ryegrass in the bottom little table, the mean NDF of all the cultivars in autumn was 46.3, in spring was 47.5. The mean minimum in autumn was 40 and the mean maximum was 50. So some varieties had 40, the worst one 50. And in spring, the best ones had, the minimum was 42.9, while the worst ones had 50.6. So that is just to compare it to ryegrass. And more detailed data and graphs are available in the booklet, and I would encourage you to look at those. Just to acknowledge the plant science team as well as farm for their support. Without all these people, it would not be possible to collect all this data.
There are many different feed additives available on the market, and last year we evaluated Aspergillus oryzae metabolites as a supplement to cows grazing Kikuyu ryegrass pasture. The profitability of milk production is under pressure as input costs rise all the time and milk price is not keeping trade with that. And we know that milk production is limited by energy intake. Rumen capacity of cows is one of the limiting factors, and therefore the rate of passage that digester moves through the digestive system is very important. Fiber digestion also plays an important role in terms of rate of passage through the digestive tract. And fungi have the potential as a feed additive to impact on fiber digestion. So Aspergillus oryzae is a fungi, so there are metabolites derived from Aspergillus oryzae. That is a possible additive that can be used for dairy cows. And these fungi break down cellulose and hemicellulose. The idea is that it has to open up the fiber structure for bacteria to be able to attach. This then enables rumen bacteria to digest fiber at a faster rate. Many studies have been done on supplementation of different fungi, Aspergillus oryzae metabolites, and results that have been reported indicate a higher dry matter intake and an increase in fat-corrected milk. However, most of these studies have been done on TMR diets, and the question is, how will this additive work when we feed it to cows on the pasture? The aim of the study was to determine the effect of Aspergillus oryzae metabolites on milk production and milk composition of Jersey cows grazing Kikuyu ryegrass pasture in spring. So we basically had two treatments. Treatment 1, 6 kg of a concentrate without the Aspergillus oryzae, and then 6 kg of a concentrate containing 3 grams of Aspergillus oryzae derived supplement. That would be 3 grams per cow per day. The diet's concentrates were as followed. Basically, it's a maize-based concentrate, 50% maize, some hominy chop, 19%, wheat bran 8, soybean hulls 8, and then soybean oil cake as the main protein source at 7%, and then some other feed components to balance the diet. What's important to note that on the Aspergillus oryzae, there was a 0.5 kilogram of Aspergillus oryzae per ton. The product that was used was Amafirm, then fed at 3 grams per cow per day. The chemical composition of concentrates is basically 87% dry matter, crude protein on a dry matter basis 13.9, Me 12.1, NDF reasonably low at 18, starch 46%, calcium at 1.0, phosphorus at 0.41, and magnesium at 0.4. Materials and methods. We used 40 Jersey cows with 20 cows per treatment that were used in a randomized block design. So cows were blocked according to milk production, days in milk, and lactation number. And we had 2 treatments, control, and then Aspergillus oryzae metabolite treatment. We had an adaptation period of 21 days followed by a 40-day measurement period. Cows grazed on 7-hectare Kikuyu ryegrass pasture under irrigation, and after each milking, fresh pasture was allocated to the cows. Pasture was fertilized with 33 kg of nitrogen after each grazing in the form of 101, and concentrates were fed during milking at 6 kg per cow per day with 3 kg at each milking. Body weight and condition score were determined at the start and the end of each of the study, and milk production was determined daily. Composition, fat, protein, lactose, MUN, somatic cell count was determined on a composite sample of the morning and afternoon milk, and this was done 4 times in 4 different weeks. Representative samples of pasture and concentrate were taken weekly during the measurement period, and these were then analyzed for quite a number of different nutrients. Moving to the results, so the effect of Aspergillus oryzae metabolites supplementation at 3 grams of Amafirm per cow per day on production parameters of Jersey cows that were supplemented with 6 kg of concentrate while grazing ryegrass during spring were as follows. Milk production for control 20 kilogram. Aspergillus oryzae metabolite treatment 20.7 wasn't significantly different. However, fat-corrected milk increased significantly from 22.3 to 24.0. Milk fat increased from 4.77 to 5.09, quite a substantial increase. Milk protein increased from 3.98 to 4.12. These increases were significant. Lactose was around 4.7. MUN levels at the lower margin was at 8.1 and 8.4. Somatic cell count was excellent at 169 and 162,000 somatic cell counts per milliliter. Looking at the live weight of the cows at the start, no significant difference at the start. Around 400 kilogram, all cows gained weight. Again, no significant difference between the different groups. At the end of the study, live weight gain was also similar. Condition of the cows were around 2.3 at the start of the study and 2.4, a bit more than 2.4 at the end of the study. Nutritional composition of concentrates fed and also the ryegrass is given in table 4. Dry matter concentrates 91, around 91. Pasture 13% dry matter. Crude protein content of the concentrates was 11.6 and 11.1, and the pasture contained 18.5% protein. The metabolizable energy content 12.5 for the concentrates and 10.6 for the pasture. NDF content of the concentrates around 11%. Pasture contained 40% NDF. ADF 4.86, so around 4.8 for the concentrates and 29.3 for the pasture. Fat content of concentrates 2.5 and 2.25, whilst pasture had a slightly higher fat content of 4.38. Calcium content of the concentrates between 1.4 and 1.5, only 0.42% calcium in the pasture. Phosphorus around 0.45, between 0.48 and 0.45 for the concentrates and only 0.38 for pasture. Magnesium content was 0.41 and 0.43 for the two concentrates and 0.31 for pasture. Potash content 0.94, 0.88, and then the pasture reasonably high potash content of 3.91. Moving to the microminerals, interesting to see that pasture had an oversupply of sodium and an undersupply of copper, zinc, and manganese, whilst iron was an oversupply again. One can see that the different concentrates addressed these shortages quite well, as these microminerals were supplemented in the premix. All the pasture strips were measured before and after grazing. So the before grazing height was 23.7 on the disc meter. That represented about 2.1 ton of dry matter. After grazing, 10.2. So this indicates that pasture management was quite good. And that's the equation that we did use. So some conclusions. Supplementation of Aspergillus oryzae metabolized to Jersey cows grazing Kikuyu ryegrass during spring. This was then done by supplementing 3 grams of Amifirm per cow per day, resulted in an increase of fat-corrected milk by 1.7 kilogram per cow per day, an increase in milk fat of 0.32%. That's quite substantial, and a significant increase in milk protein of 0.14. Thank you very much. This presentation is about an old problem. At Outeniqua, we've also had our problems with milk fever in the past, but since 2020, we have followed another way to counter this problem, and we have been feeding a calcium binder to our cows around calving, and then keep the cows on high quality pasture. So I want to share with you some of the information that we've gathered on prevention of milk fever using this approach. Milk fever symptoms are well known to farmers. It happens around calving. The cow walks unsteadily. You see some muscle spasms, some nervous symptoms. Then you get a downer cow. Muscular weakness occurs. There's depression of consciousness. Typically, the head is twisted backwards, and we experience this more with older cows and also higher producers. It's possible that between 5 and 10% of cows will be affected. Milk fever has really been really an old problem that's been with us for many years. It is well known that Jersey cows are more susceptible than Holstein cows, and we experience here an increase in calcium demand around calving. This happens when the production of milk is started and the colostrum milk is being produced. A lot of calcium is drawn out of the system into the udder, and then there's a critical shortage of calcium in the blood. With clinical milk fever, the blood calcium levels drop below 1.4 millimole per liter, and with subclinical milk fever, the blood calcium levels are between 2 and 1.4 millimole per liter, and normal blood calcium levels are between 2 and 2.6 millimoles per liter. With subclinical milk fever, we still have a lot of negative impacts, like possible difficult calving, lower milk production, higher incidence of mastitis, and displaced abomasum. So yeah, there are many downsides to this problem. Feeding of anionic salts has been the method of choice to prevent milk fever, but when you feed anionic salts, you cannot keep cows on pasture. You have to feed roughage with a low potash content. What is happening here is we calculate the dietary cation-anion difference, the cations being sodium and potash, and anions chloride and sulfur. You need to get to a DCAD value of minus 100 to minus 200 milliequivalents per kilogram. The problem here is that pasture contains between 3 and 6% potash, and it's virtually impossible to get to the required DCAD level. So with anionic salts, the approach is to acidify the blood to increase calcium mobilization. Cows are fed a low potash roughage in a paddock, so you have to replace the pasture with something like maize silage or triticale silage, oat hay, or another low potash type of content. At Outeniqua, we've been keeping our cows now on pasture before calving since September 2020, and we are very happy with the results up to this. So for us, it was all about a change in system. Is it paddock or is it pasture? Paddock being dirty and the pasture being clean. Do you feed anionic salts that are not palatable, or a calcium binder? So we actually made a decision to go the pasture route, as this is a cleaner and more effective route for us. Here you can see it's like two worlds. At the top, clean pasture being allocated every day or every second day. At the bottom, cows are in a dirty environment. There are much more pathogens available or present in that system, and many more challenges. It's more labor intensive too. So let's talk a bit about the calcium binder approach. So feeding a diet that's low in calcium is not easy, because most roughages contain at least 0.4% calcium. So a cow grazing Kikuyu ryegrass, 10 kilogram dry matter per day would take in about 40 grams of calcium. When you feed synthetic calcium binder, Excelit, at 400 grams per cow per day, you're able to bind the 40 grams of calcium, because 100 gram of Excelit binds 10 grams of calcium. So Excelit is a synthetic calcium binder, so it's pure, that differentiated from other zeolites that you might be able to mine, so it's being researched quite well. The idea is to induce a calcium deficiency 14 to 21 days before calving. Let the cow start mobilize calcium from her bones before calving, so that when she calves, she's not in trouble. Comparing the two systems, anionic salts versus a calcium binder. With anionic salts, the cows are in a paddock, they're being fed a trough. With a calcium binder, the cows are on pasture, clean pasture allocated daily. With anionic salts, you have to buy or produce a low potash roughage. That can be more costly, at about 2,500 Rand per ton, than when you grow pasture at 1,500 Rand a ton. Looking at the prepartum concentrate, with anionic salts, less expensive than with a calcium binder, at about 6,000 Rand a ton. With a calcium binder, it can go up to 15,000 Rand a ton. Anionic salt system requires more labor. You have to move more food around and you're in a dirty environment. In a calcium binder system, less labor needed. With anionic salts, the cows are not adapted to pasture. Calcium binder cows are already on pasture that they're going to be, same type of pasture they're going to be on after calving, so they're well adapted to pasture. With anionic salts, it can be an advantage that you need no pasture, because that makes more pasture available for lactating cows. And in the calcium binder system, you'll have to allocate a number of hectares to your pre-parting cows, taking that away from the milk platform. Looking at the feed cost for anionic salts, estimated about 903 Rand per cow over a transition period, versus for the calcium binder 1,260. So it's possible that the cost might be 360 Rand higher per cow on the calcium binder system. So it is definitely more expensive. However, what we need to keep in mind is that we might have less milk fever, might have improved condition on cows, might have increased milk production, and lower calf mortality. So there are many benefits on the calcium binder system. So how effective was this system? We've been on this since 2020, and we've calved 600, we had 600 multifarious calvings since then. During that period, we still had 11 clinical milk fever cases, so it's 1.8%, that's quite low. Interestingly enough, those cases were during June and July, so the winter months. So what is different during the winter months? We're an extreme high quality pasture that might have a higher potash content and a lower magnesium content. We are short of grass, maybe too short grazing cycles, so we have to look further into this to reduce that, because we still can to improve on that. But in short, one can say the system has been very effective. What one must keep in mind is that do not graze roughages that contain high levels of calcium, like clover, lucerne, plantain, or chicory prepartum, because then the challenge to bind that calcium will be much, much higher. So we allocated between 6 and 8 hectares Kikuyu ryegrass under irrigation for our steam ups, and we've been using that area since 2020. What's important in the total diet for these cows, one must ensure that magnesium levels are sufficient at 0.45%, calcium not higher than 0.5%, phosphorus below 0.45%, and don't go too high levels of potash. Try and keep it as low as possible, but as long as it's lower than 4.5%, everything should be fine. So to conclude, Keeping cows on irrigated Kikuyu ryegrass pasture prepartum and feeding a concentrate containing an effective calcium binder effectively prevented milk fever. And it is definitely a viable alternative to feeding low potash roughages and anionic salts. Thank you very much.